So a quick note for today, bulbs in general are just such a large topic that we are really focusing our attention down on the spring planted bulbs, the bulbs that are going to bloom in the summertime. We're not talking about the bulbs that are blooming right now, your daffodils or alliums or tulips and whatnot. We're talking about the ones that are going to give you summertime bloom. So what is a summer blooming bulb? Really, it is any kind of group of plants that has its food storage organ underneath the ground. There are true bulbs like lilies. There are plants like dahlias and caladiums that we term as tubers. Cannas are ones that have rhizomes, and then gladiolas are corms. They're all slightly different botanical terms for essentially the same function for the plant itself. Most of these plants are not considered hardy, so we do have to dig them up in the fall or replant them each spring. And a lot of them are a little bit more exotic looking or tropical looking, so they kind of bring a nice touch to your garden. A little bit more exotic, a little bit more showy than some of the more perennial plants. Although we will talk about some lilies that will overwinter. So here's just a little visual demonstration of what these guys look like. We've got your rhizomes, a canna. We've got those tubers, which almost look potatoey. Potatoes are also a tuber, which are your dahlias. Those true bulbs, your lilies, and then those corms that look very similar to a true bulb, but are a little bit different, the corms from a gladiola. So this is a really nice time to be in nurseries shopping. Everyone's fully stocked, everyone's super enthusiastic about your gardens and excited to get things going for the year. And so if you're shopping in person, you definitely should look for a couple different things in your bulbs as you're looking for them. You want to make sure that they're nice and firm, they're not mushy or soft, and you want to make sure that they're fairly large. That's something that you're really going to get a feel for over time. The larger bulbs have more energy in them stored to give you bigger, better blooms in the long term. And then if you don't want to order it online in person, if you want to make sure that you're getting some kind of specialty variety or a little bit better selection, you can definitely get from catalogs or online stores. And from there, you can make your selection based on what you want them to look like. Obviously, you can't pick out based on if they're firm or soft or whatnot, but generally speaking, most of the big name bulb companies have excellent products. When you're thinking about how you want to place summer blooming bulbs, there's a couple different things that you really need to be aware of. Most of our summer blooming bulbs really do require a lot of sunshine. So they need at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight each day. If they're shadier than that, then you're not going to get the vibrant bloom or the intense bloom and the good blooms set. That said, if you are planning to plant for the really poppy color, if you've got some very bright colors, very intense sunlight, so maybe 10 hours or more each day, could potentially fade the colors themselves. So plan your space accordingly. If it's a really shady spot, maybe think about something else besides the summer blooming bulbs that we will be talking about today. I saw a quick question about advantages for purchasing online. Really, you have more variety choices online than you have in a store. And most of the bulb companies are really good at, they have really good product. So you might get a little bit better product than perhaps a small nursery that doesn't stock as many things. All right, so then you've figured out where you want your summer blooming bulbs to go. You want to think about the ground you're putting them in. Most of these summer blooming bulbs, they aren't native here. Obviously, we have to pull them for the winter time. They don't overwinter. So they want a pretty good situation to be living in. They want soil that is going to be moist, but that drains well. So if your soil is really heavy clay that holds on to moisture, you might want to do some amendment of it before you start planting, just to kind of improve that drainage. And you might want to think about adding a little bit of fertilizer, because a lot of these don't tolerate really poor soils well. They like a little bit of extra nutrients for them. This is some kind of drill like this is kind of a ridiculous way to plant bulbs, but it's also kind of a nice way because you really can get those holes nice and deep and get those bulbs nestled in snugly into the ground. When to plant, this is going to be really important for all of these, particularly for the varieties that are not winter hardy. You want to make sure that the soils are dry and drier, they're not soaking wet, which is not an issue this year in Colorado, but also that they're warm. So you'll usually get good growth from your bulbs when your soils are around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's really easy to test your soil temperature. Make sure that if you have a spouse who's particular and you're using a kitchen thermometer, that you specify that it's your garden kitchen thermometer and not your vegetable or meat kitchen thermometer. Have a dedicated thermometer. You put it in the ground 6 to 8 inches deep, or as deep as it will go if it's a smaller one, in the morning. So usually between 7 and 9 a.m. is going to give you the best time for a reading, because that's when soil temperatures will be at their coolest over the course of the day. And test that soil temperature. That way you know that it's a good time to be getting stuff up. I tend to be a little bit of a lazy gardener. If I start to see the bindweed that is rife throughout my yard coming up, I know those soil temperatures are up. And so that's a little bit of a cheat way. If you kind of figure out what weeds that you can't get rid of are growing, then you can kind of do it that way. But a soil thermometer is the very best route. If your soils are very, very cold or very, very wet, it can lead to rot in these roots. And so it's definitely a good idea to wait if we're really cool and we're really wet, like we were last year. All right, so we're going to talk about what we want to plant. We're going to start off with dahlias, and then we'll talk about cannas, we'll talk about some lilies, we'll talk about gladiolus, and we'll talk about caladium.
Thanks, Cassie. And I just want to mention my beagle Maple is not that skinny now. That was right when we first adopted her, so she was slightly gaunt. All right, let's kick it off with dahlias, because dahlias are kind of the poster child of our summer blooming bulbs, and they are amazing, basically. They come in all sorts of colors and shapes and sizes and heights, and so dahlias aren't as intimidating as you should think they are, because they can actually be really easy to grow. The one thing, though, is you want to look at the overall height of your dahlias, because if they're really tall, they will need some supplemental staking, which we'll talk about. Essentially, for planting, they're a tuber, so think of like kind of a big flat potato, and you're going to put them on their sides. So you're going to dig shallow trenches in your garden. You'll want to space them accordingly, depending on what size dahlia they're going to be at maturity. But you'll put the tubers on their side, you'll cover them with the soil, and then you will actually start to water them in once they sprout. You don't need to water until they sprout, because again, Cassie mentioned how sometimes too wet soils can lead to root rot. So this is what they would look like. Again, those shallow trenches. So just kind of like any other vegetable, which is really nice. They don't need to be overly deep, maybe 6 to 8 inches deep at planting. And for ease, if you are needing to stake, if they're not those shorter varieties, it is easiest to put the stake in when you plant, because it's a little bit hard. You don't want to go in and put your stake in and actually end up stabbing your tubers once they've started to grow. Mulching with wood mulch, we would always recommend that. If you want to use something else organic like grass clippings or weed-free straw, those are also good options. But a lot of the times you're going to incorporate these into a landscape bed. And so the existing mulch that you have in the landscape, the organic mulch you have, is going to work. So for staking, you can really use anything you want. You can use a sturdier bamboo pole. You could use one of those green plastic stakes that you can readily find at any garden center. And essentially, as the plant starts to grow, you're going to stake it with something loose so it doesn't cut into the stem about every 18 inches. So at the end of the summer, if you're growing some of the large dinner plate size dahlias, you might have a plant that's 4, 5, or even 6 feet tall. If you've ever visited the gardens in Oregon where they grow a lot of these tubers, they're huge and you can get lost just like in a cornfield. But definitely start to stake as you go. And a single stake is all you need to do. A tomato cage or something like that is not necessary, because these are really coming from one stem. If you do want to grow dahlias in containers, I've done this for a few years and it is successful. Essentially, it's 1 tuber per pot, and the pot needs to be at least 12 by 12. So at least 12 inches wide and 12 inches deep. So it is kind of a lot of stuff that you have to provide for just 1 tuber. But because, again, these can be very large plants, you want to accommodate it. So if you're growing larger dahlias, just know if you have something that's 4 to 5 feet in a container, it can be more prone to wind damage and just getting damaged in general. So I would recommend that you use the shorter types for containers, and they will be successful. Staking is also going to be important in this case, unless they're the really dwarf types. But essentially, you'll plant them 4 to 6 inches deep. You'll cover them with potting media, and then you're going to treat it like any other container plant. Regular water, regular fertilizer, and then making sure that you are harvesting the plants if you want to enjoy them indoors. So a lot of these are cut flower gardens. Amy, I know, has done a number of presentations on cut flower gardening, and dahlias are a wonderful cut flower that you can also bring indoors. So I think the next is we're going to look at a few types of dahlias, and just know there's lots of different shapes and sizes of them. There's at least 12 different types that you can buy. And so if you go to one of the mail order catalogs, or even if you're out shopping locally, you'll often start to see different types of dahlias. So we're just going to run through a few of them, not all of them, but just a few of them. And the first one is going to be our Dinnerplate dahlias that we pregnant pause for the slide to change. There we go. Our Dinnerplate dahlias are going to be larger than 8 inches. So all of our dahlia types are going to be classified mostly by how big they are. And so if you really want a wow factor, if you're looking for a single flower for an arrangement, this is all you would need. You would need to just plant a few Dinnerplate dahlias. We will provide this list of cultivars, and these are just recommended cultivars. There are so many other types out there. There are hundreds of different types of dahlia cultivars. So you can pick the ones that are the colors you want, that are the textures you want, and go from there. But these are just a few of them. But the Dinnerplate dahlias are really, really showy. The next one are the Decorative dahlias. These are slightly smaller, usually about 4 to 8 inches across, and so that is the diameter of it itself. And these are the ones that are going to have the widest range of color and also styles. The flowers, the petals themselves, are going to be slightly rolled, so they're going to be a little bit cupped, as you can tell, or even a little bit flat. And so if you're a dahlia aficionado, if you really love them, you're going to start to learn some of these terms. But Decorative dahlias, a couple of them, Arabian Night, Labyrinth, White Onestra is probably one of the most common. It's a really beautiful, pure white. And that's sometimes hard for our flowers because getting that pure white, sometimes they have hints of butter in them or yellow, or sometimes they might have other tints, but it is a really nice, clean white if that's what you're looking for. The next dahlia type is going to be the cactus and semi-cactus. So these are spiky. So these add a lot of great texture, not only to floral arrangements, but also to the garden in general. So the petals on these are going to be partially or fully rolled. So they might actually cup and touch on the opposite side of the petals, which is what gives them a spiky look. And I do want to say that dahlias are actually really great pollinator plants, but it does depend on the type, because as you can see with the cactus, as you saw with the Decorative, as you saw with the Dinnerplate dahlias, sometimes getting into the pollen for our pollinators is really difficult, but we have a couple where it's much easier for them to access. It just depends on the flower type. So shop accordingly if you're trying to encourage pollinators to your garden. The next dahlia type is the ball and pom-pom. These are my absolute favorites because they are nice, compact, little tiny balls, only about 3 to 4 inches across. They actually do have miniature pom-pom types, which are maybe 1 to 2 inches across, but really they're ball shaped, which is absolutely incredible. I think they add so much uniqueness. This is obviously a mix. Boom Boom Red is a really good classic red. It also reminds me of Freddie Couples because his nickname is Boom Boom. I don't know why, but they're really cute and perky. So kind of a honeycomb type shape. And I think we have two more. The next one is a single type. So this is a great one for pollinators because as you can see, you can actually see the reproductive structures for the pollinator friends. So HS just refers to happy single. And so we're talking about a single flower. So just very simple petals. This looks a lot like daisies. It might look a lot like zinnias, but these are actually dahlias themselves. So happy single date, happy single flame. Those are two really common, reliable ones and ones that are really easy to find. And then the last dahlia we're going to take a peek at are some, oh no, we have two more. So this is a peony flowered. So our peony friends will be blooming in the next few weeks. So these look more like a peony type, maybe more of a rose type where there's a lot of petals, but still that open center, which is really nice. And pretty sure this is the last one. The miniature or the decorative ones, the dwarf ones, these are great for border plants. So they don't get any taller than 24 inches tall for the most part. The flowers themselves can be very large, as you can see, up to 5 inches across. So the plants are short and squat, but the flowers can be very prolific and quite large, but they're very, very sturdy too. And I think maybe that's the reason people don't plant dahlias is because they look fragile, but they're actually extremely sturdy. They're tough. They could take a lot of our weather. So I would really encourage you to give dahlias a try if you haven't in the past. And I am going to toss it over to Cassey to talk about cannas.
Thank you. All right, so cannas are a fun one if you really want something super tropical looking, if you want that exotic look in your yard, and particularly if you are doing container gardening and you want just that really showstopper central plant for your container. A lot of times they have absolutely gorgeous foliage, and I'll be showcasing some of that in some of these slides. And they are a higher water need. So if you have a pond or a water area in your landscape, these can be a really great choice to surround it. I know Denver Botanic Gardens has a bunch of these in some of their wetter parts of their gardens. When you're planting your cannas, you want to make sure that you plant those rhizomes about 6 inches deep and about 18 inches apart. These are large plants. These are not some little teeny tiny thing. And so if you are planting in containers, you're really just putting one in per container, unless that container is very, very large. I have seen some like long and slender containers that are multiple feet wide, and I've seen several cannas in those. But if it's a standard pot, even a large pot, one canna is probably sufficient, especially if you want to plant others in there as well. Usually they don't require much in the way of staking, but if we have a windy season, which we've been having just a little bit of this year, the foliage is large and it can kind of tear in the wind a little bit. So just a little bit of show of that single canna with some other lovely spiller and thriller and all of those words that I don't quite know because I don't do design for container gardens. Another showy, beautiful leaves. So there's a couple different cultivars. If you are going for green foliage, Aida, City of Portland, Miss Oklahoma, or Richard Wallace. Of course, Black Knight is like the standard for that really dark burgundy leaf foliage. And then if you want variegated, the Bengal tiger is lovely. Inferno is also got those like kind of orange streaks in it. So very cool. There's that Black Knight. So those very dark leaves, very striking reddish orangish flower. And then Cleopatra, of course, showstopper for those incredible leaves. Okay, then we've got lilies. When Alison and I were talking about this, she was all gung-ho for getting rid of lilies to cut this down to 1 hour, and I was all gung-ho for lilies are one of my favorites. They're most important. I've got one on my background here. Only the plants that are in the Lilium genus are true lilies. There are others that are called lilies, but they're not. So make sure you check the scientific name if you really want to make sure if you've got a lily. They have large, very showy flowers that are usually shaped kind of like a trumpet. Their leaves are in sets of 6, 3 and 3. If you look here, you've got 3 and 3. So if you find a flower that's called a lily but doesn't have those 6, it probably is just kind of a common name instead of a true lily. And many of them have petals that kind of curl backwards a little bit. The flowers might nod downward a little bit. The one in the background on me, I duck out of the way, that kind of nods downward, but some of them pop upwards as well. And you can get so many different colors in lilies. They're really kind of incredible for their variety in colors. So when we're thinking about planting, of course, like I already had said, lilies do require full sun. You want to plant your bulbs 4 to 6 inches deep. And if it's a smaller lily, if it's some of the shorter ones, maybe only 2 to 4 inches deep. And you want to do it pretty early in the season, once the soil can be worked. These aren't one that are as sensitive to cold soils as like dahlias are, for example. For your very best show, you want to plant them about 8 to 12 inches apart in groups of 3 to 5. This is the standard rule for design. You never want to have 1 or 2. You don't want straight lines. You want to kind of stagger them a little bit just for aesthetics. And if you want to, you can space your groupings 3 to 5 feet apart. And you can, if you're not buying them as bulbs, you can plant them anytime during the growing season. This is the one that you're most likely to probably be getting as a grown flowering plant, and then you'll put in the ground. So we'll get into some types of lilies. These are reliable perennials. These are ones that do not need to be dug in the fall, unlike some of the others. So if you want something that you don't have to think about, I know I am a lazy gardener. If I put in any of these others, I treat them like an expensive annual, essentially. But lilies I love because they do come back year after year. The Oriental lilies, the Asiatic lilies, and the Turk's cap lilies will all come back year after year. So first off, we'll get into Asiatic lilies. Asiatic lilies are super easy to grow. They're not very picky about our soil, as long as it's well drained, as long as the water doesn't pool and stick around and keep with very, very wet soil. Asiatic lilies are very hardy, and they're tough. They're not one that's going to flop over under its own weight. They're able to support themselves. So you don't need to stake them. Once in a while, if you're in a really windy area or if they grew a lot because they had a lot of moisture, a little bit might be okay, but generally speaking, they do not need support. And these Asiatic lilies are going to give you the widest color range throughout any of the lilies. Often they kind of have these lovely little flecks, which I kind of like to imagine as attracting beacons for our pollinators. And they come in a lot of different varieties, or a lot of different varieties in size. So you can get ones that are very small if you have an area that you don't want a lot, or if you have a border and you want to dwarf the young children in your life. It's kind of fun to have a lily that is up to 5 feet tall. The downside with our Asiatic lilies is that they are not fragrant. So if you're seeking the fragrant ones, it's not going to be the best choice for you. Just some beautiful pictures of, like, just look at those different colors. You've got the yellows, you've got the reddish oranges, you've got the purples. There's not much in the way of like a true blue, but there's kind of the purpley kind of direction. Then we've got our Asiatic lily some of our Asiatic lily cultivars. Connecticut King has a very nice golden yellow. It's about 3 to 4 feet tall. Nice June blooming. So if you haven't gotten it in the ground, it's definitely would be time to do it or buy it as a plant this year. And then Crete is a lovely dark pink, 3 to 4 feet high, a little bit later bloomer, June into July. We've got our Oriental lilies, and it's a little confusing. We've got Asiatic and Oriental, and they are different. So just kind of be aware of that as you're looking around. Oriental lilies are increasingly becoming popular. They're often quite tall, up to 6 feet tall, and they really bloom fairly late in the summer, about as the Asiatics are finishing. So they are a nice one to kind of plant together in different discrete clumps. If you want to have that continual bloom happening. They usually do not because they are so large, they have such a large flower, they really do perform best if they're protected from afternoon sun and any kind of strong winds. So if you have a little bit of a more sheltered area along a fence line or something, then that might be a great place to put some of these. The shining glory of our Oriental lilies, of course, is that they are fragrant. They are incredibly, wonderfully fragrant. And there are many varieties you can mulch really heavily. So put 6 to 12 inches of mulch over the area, and that will help them overwinter for us here along the Front Range, at least. So there's some examples. I have one that looks very similar to this. I don't know if it's the exact cultivar, but lots of pinks, lots of whites and yellows. Black Beauty is a really lovely one. Stargazer, which is what this one is. I always forget the name. But both great choices for growing, at least particularly here along the Front Range. And they both are, like I said, later bloomers. So July into August, you'll be starting to see blooms come out for these guys. Then we've got our Turk's Cap lily. These ones are a smaller flower. They tend to nod downwards, and then those petals curl up very strongly behind them. Kind of looks like a Turk cap. The flowers are usually yellow, orange, yellow, white, sometimes a little bit of a reddish burgundy, and they usually do have those kind of flecks or spots on them. The plants can be quite tall. They can get up to 7 feet tall. Usually 4 to 5. I've seen 4 to 5 feet here, unless they're getting really, really well watered. And they are an earlier summer bloomer as compared to the Oriental. Okay.
So it is funny when Cassey and I were planning this presentation of the ones we wanted to cover, and I held out for gladiolus just because this is a plant that reminds me of my childhood. It's such an old-fashioned plant, and to me, it's just so like romantic. It brings back such great memories. My mom had a dear friend named Pete, who was an incredible gardener, and he would plant rows and rows and rows of gladiolas every year, and she would always get a nice bunch of them when they were in bloom. So gladiolas to me are a definite in the home landscape, and the one thing I love about them is that they're so skinny. So they can like fill in little pockets and little gaps where you might not have a lot of other space available. So don't consider gladiolas to be an old fuddy-duddy. I think they definitely have a place in the landscape. Cassey mentioned how some of these would be considered kind of an expensive annual, and gladiolas, although you can overwinter them, which we'll get into in a few slides, although you can overwinter them, it might not be worth it. The corms themselves are fairly inexpensive, and because you're planting a lot of them, it might not be worth your time or investment to dig them up, but that's up to you. So just consider them. So gladiolas are a spike plant, so nice, tall, and skinny, and they come in every color of the rainbow, including a true green. So there's 2 colors that really gardeners, maybe 3, we absolutely loathe after. Like we want them, and that's a true black, which there are some petunias now, true blue. Icelandic poppies are a great true blue. And then there's a true green. So Bells of Ireland is one, and I think Gladiolas is one as well. So the corms, they're little flat kind of pockets. I believe we have a photo coming up, but they're little flat corms. So if you've ever planted crocus, very, very similar, you only need to plant them 3 inches deep. So if you don't have great soil or you don't feel like digging very deep, gladiolas are a nice one to plant because you don't have to put too much effort into digging. So 3 inches deep, about 6 inches apart. These also can grow in a container if it's big enough. And what's nice again is because they're a little bit taller, you could use them to line the back of your border. I wouldn't use them along a sidewalk just because they can obstruct views, but they're really nice along the back of the sidewalk. And then as for cutting, when we're going to cut our gladiolas, they're going to open from the bottom up. So it's a nice spike. So when the first 2 flowers at the bottom are in bloom, that's when you can actually cut them and bring them indoors. And then the flowers will proceed as they go up the stems. I think we have a photo of what that looks like if you're not familiar with what gladiolas look like. So we can do the next slide, Cassey. So the first 2 bottom blooms, this is when you would cut them. And then there are usually at least 8 to 10 blooms total on the plant. They'll have a few strappy leaves, but they're really nice to add to a flower arrangement, kind of as the back part, just to add a little bit more structure. So you could pair this with some of the canna leaves, that would look gorgeous. If you're growing any other cut flowers like zinnias, or you could even cut them with some hosta foliage, that would look beautiful too. So that's when you would want to cut them. Sometimes you see them in the grocery stores when they haven't started blooming, and don't worry, they will, but it does give a little bit better of a look to your bouquets when you do have a couple flowers in bloom. And a couple different ones you can consider. So I mentioned how gladiolus come in every color of the rainbow. They are also bicolored, which makes them even more attractive. So you can find a color combination that works for you. So this is Fun Time with kind of a carmine red and a yellow throat. I went to Iowa State, so this is a great cyclone cultivar for us. And then I do have, the next slide is the green. So this is Green Star, and you may not like it, and I totally get it. But just remember that gladiolus do have this beautiful green color. And what I love too about glads is that their flowers are a little ruffly, so they're just a little bit more fancy. And as a plant, you can absolutely cut 3 to 5 stems and put those in a vase of water, and it would provide a lot of show. And they do bloom for a long period of time, so you'll get at least a week's bloom out of them when you cut them and bring them indoors. So if you're going to plant them in containers, there's what those corms look like. So the container depth should be at least 12 inches deep and wide, so very similar to our dahlia size, but you can pack the corms into the container because you really want a very impressive show. So you're going to plant the corms a little bit deeper than you would in the ground, about 4 to 6 inches deep, about 2 inches apart. So we're going to plant them. And I should also mention that gladiolas can be succession planted. So just like you would plant beans every 2 weeks to get them to bloom for a longer period of time, you can do the same thing with gladiolas. So you could plant the first set maybe in a week or so, or even right now, we should be getting to the right proper temperatures. Maybe in 2 weeks at the beginning of June, you do another set so that you have this extension of bloom with your flowers, which then extends the life of your cut flower time as well. If you don't cut the flowers, that's fine. You don't need to use them as cut flowers. Then you can keep removing those spent flower heads. So essentially, you're going to be deadheading on the stem themselves, and then you're going to leave the foliage just like you would with your daffodils and tulips. You're going to allow the photosynthesis to provide energy back into the bulb, and then once that stalk has withered to brown, that's when you can then cut it off. So 2 trains of thought, you can absolutely use them in the landscape if you just want to enjoy them, if you're not bringing them indoors. So caladiums are our next one. I also love caladiums. I did an internship in Georgia, and the resort was kind of known for having its caladiums. They forced a lot in their greenhouses. And let me tell you, doing a tour of a greenhouse in summer in Georgia is not a pleasant feat, which is why we did those tours at night. But caladiums are a foliage plant. So everything to this point has some sort of flower, even the cannas, but caladiums are truly a foliage plant. And if you have shady spots, so for those of you who don't have full sun, these are the plant that you can absolutely use. And I love a foliage plant. I love hosta, I love heuchera, those plants that where the leaves really give us a lot of color. They add so much to the garden. So these are true foliage plants. They need shady conditions, so do not put them on your south-facing porch, but they're also perfect for containers. And so if you are designing this amazing container with shade-loving plants, add some caladiums. These are not hardy to Colorado. So the only one we talked about today that will overwinter successfully outdoors is going to be the lilies that Cassey mentioned. All of the others have to be dug up and put in the basement for the winter, but we'll get to that. So just know caladiums will not overwinter in our cold winter temperatures. So caladium history, they're another old-fashioned plant. So like the gladiolas, I'm a sucker for old-fashioned. They have been around since the 1700s, and so they are very old, and they're very, very ubiquitous to some parts. So to England and some of the European areas, very, very common, and then they came over to the United States. What's so neat about them is that the difference in their veining and colors for that leaf can vary among cultivars. And there's been a lot of breeding and genetics that have gone into this. So they have some, as you can see, that have pink. some that are white, some that are green, some are spotted. And so any variation of these colors you might find. So the great thing about caladiums is that you may not love the one with pink, but maybe you like the one in the front that has more of a white leaf. So there's a lot of different types you can consider. And what's cool, botanically speaking, is that there's actually no leaves on this plant. The leaves, or there's no stems. They're not a stem, I'm sorry. It doesn't come from a stem, it comes from a petiole. So the next photo shows what a petiole is. And just like any leaf on a tree or a house plant, that long brown thing is actually a petiole, and that's what attaches to the base. So these petioles arise from the base of the plant, which is then where the leaf forms. So it's just unusual. It's just kind of cool. You don't need to care about that really. It's just fun cocktail knowledge that you can use later. So just know that they're born from a petiole and then the leaf is there. So a couple different cultivars that you can consider. There's two types. There's the fancy leaf and then the lance leaf. So let's take a look at the fancy leaf. These are very large leaves and very long petioles. So they're big plants. That's what you need to remember. The petioles can be anywhere from 12 to 30 inches long. Then you have this very large leaf, and they're usually heart-shaped, as you can see there, or semi-heart shaped. So a really striking look. And for a container, one bulb might be all you need. I mean, that would give you quite the show. If you have something that's taller, that's going to be helpful. But again, very long petioles with large leaves. The lance leaf caladiums are a little bit smaller. Do the next slide. They're a little bit smaller and they might have a slight ruffle to the edge. So they have a little bit more movement to them, which is really nice. So a more compact plant. So if you don't have a lot of space, the lance leaf caladiums might be a better option if you don't have a really large container. And you're going to get more leaves per tuber than the fancy leaf type. So you're going to get more foliage because they're smaller, and that tuber is going to put out a lot more leaves because it doesn't take as many resources. But just know that there are so many cultivars out there. And again, these are shade plants. So this is where you would pop them. They can get a little bit of morning sun, but really they need protection from afternoon blazing sun. So the next slide is planting caladiums. They are very, very, very intolerant of any cold temperatures. So this is one that if you're in the Front Range, I might, if you haven't started them, don't put them into the ground until probably the end of May or early June, just because they're frost intolerant. You can buy them pre-sprouted, which is great. So the nurseries and garden centers, or maybe you already did this, about 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost. And we're late this year. It seems like things are a little bit more slow to wake up. And so I haven't looked at the nighttime temperatures, but you do want those nighttime temperatures to be above 50 degrees, if not 60 degrees, before you move these guys outside. But you can look for potted plants. You can start there this summer. And then if you really get into caladiums, you can then go online or find places locally that sell different types, and you can actually start to force them indoors, usually sometime in mid-April. If you do bring anything home from the garden center or the greenhouse, just remember to harden them off. Usually those are grown in ideal conditions and they're babied. So if you come from a greenhouse and you put them outside into a cold wind, your plants aren't going to be happy. That's kind of a general rule for anything that you're bringing home, including your tomatoes and peppers and all of your other annuals. The next slide is just to show you a little bit of variation on what you can buy. These are all the fancy leaf types. So Rosebud has that deep pink throat. White Christmas is more of a true white with some green veining. Candidium, that's actually the Latin name of the caladiums. So kind of pink veination, which is absolutely gorgeous. Carolyn Wharton is another one. So you can just see the differences, and then you can start to mix and match the annuals that you might plant with them, or partnering other plants, maybe even another just greenhouse plant outside on a patio can really dress up a space. So just consider the caladiums there. So Cassie's now going to talk about fall care and winter care of bulbs.
Yes. So yeah, most of these guys are not hardy. They're not going to survive over winter unless you dig them out, because we just get too cold. They didn't evolve in our climate, so they need to be dug after we've had our first killing frost. But there are exceptions, of course. The lilies that I talked about, most of those will overwinter, particularly if you mulch them in really well. And some of them you might just choose to treat as an annual. When you are thinking about trying to keep your bulbs in the fall, once we've had that freeze, you want to cut the foliage about 6 inches off of the ground, above the ground. Leave a little bit of stem length. Then for many of these, this is dahlias pictured here, you'll want to use a spade or a trowel, or I like to use a garden fork, just so I'm not as likely to slice my tubers, to dig them up. If you have any cut bulbs or nicked bulbs or damaged bulbs, they're not going to overwinter as well when you're storaging them. So you want to make sure that you're careful about them. If you do slice one, that one might be a sacrifice. You'll want to loosen the soil around the bulb, lift it out of the ground, and then I'll talk about how to store them. One thing that I love to suggest for any of these is kind of a pot in pot method. So if you don't want to deal with digging it up, avoiding damaging the roots and such, you can plant your bulbs in a pot and then put it into another pot in the ground or into a hole in the ground. And then when fall comes along, it's easy to know where they are. You haven't forgotten because there's a pot there. You pull that pot out, you take care of the bulbs, and you overwinter them. I'll say it once for good measure, make sure you label everything. I am the worst for this. I always plant something or I store something and I think, well, of course I'm going to remember this. It's so clear in my mind right now. I know exactly what this is. I know exactly when I pulled it. I know exactly how I managed it. And then 6 months later or 12 months later, sometimes I realize that I have no idea. And so just a quick little label on the pot or in the container or on the bag, however you're storing it, depending on the bulb, just put a little label so you know what you've got, and particularly if you want to know what variety it is. My mother is famously bad at this. She gives me something that she's saved from her garden and, well, what is it? Oh, it's a dahlia. Well, what color is it? Oh, I don't know. So it can get a little bit frustrating if you want to know what you're putting in, or if you have a plan, if you're going to thematically have a yellow area in your ornamental bed or something like that, you want to make sure you know what that plant is. Next step, once you've lifted those bulbs out, you do want to allow them time to cure. Cure essentially means that you are letting the wounds you've created by pulling them out of the ground seal off so that you're not as prone to getting rot into the bulb itself. Curing can take hours up to weeks, depending on the species. Effectively, you want to check and make sure that you're not seeing any wet areas. To the process of curing, you want to lay them out in a cool place on a raised screen. A lot of times you can just kind of make a screen with some 2x4s and some hardware cloth, which is what's pictured here. Lay them on, if you don't have a screen like that, you can lay them on the ground on like a piece of cardboard or paper bags or something like that, and turn them so that you don't have a wet spot. Make sure that you're curing out of the sun, and preferably indoors, because you don't want to risk getting frost on them. You don't want them to be in full sun, because that could completely desiccate them and cause complications in that respect. Generally speaking, you want to store your dried bulbs in some kind of media that will help make sure that they have good airflow, but they don't get super, super dried out. So you can use peat moss sand, vermiculite, shredded paper as shown here. Sawdust would work, wood shavings or cocoa coir would also work. If you have a lot of bulbs, you can layer them up in like this cardboard box here. There's probably numerous layers of bulbs. Don't pack them in really airtight. You want to make sure that you've got some space in between them. because you don't want moisture buildup. And keep those bulbs from touching each other. If you have one bulb that got nicked and you didn't notice, and it begins to rot and it's right next to another bulb that was fine, that rot is more likely to transfer from one bulb to the other if they're contacting each other. So lots of space, lots of air, but not a lot of air movement, so it stays moist but not wet, if that makes sense. Kind of a little bit of a balancing act for overwinter storage. Ideally, we should store our bulbs in a fairly cool temperature area. Usually I like to suggest it, like if you have an unheated garage that is in contact with your house and doesn't freeze. Generally speaking, a lot of these bulbs will tolerate temperatures sometimes down into the 30s, but in the 40s is a pretty good bet. With a higher relative humidity, having some kind of media like a vermiculite can help with retaining that humidity for the bulbs. And once in a while, check your bulbs, make sure that they're doing okay. If you start to see one really getting dehydrated, you can spray them with a spray bottle, and you can repack them. If there are any that are rotting or really, really soft and squishy, they're probably not going to successfully overwinter for you, and so they can be discarded. Specifically here for dahlias, you want to dig your dahlias before we have a hard freeze. So if we have a light freeze, I'll define a hard freeze is anything below about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Light freeze is that 28 to 32 range. So if we have a light freeze, then it's okay for our dahlias. If we have a hard freeze in our forecast, dig those tubers up. Handle them as carefully as you can. You can remove soil by dipping them in water, but you want to make sure that you let them dry out at least for several hours before you store them. Dahlias do need to be checked about monthly, and mist them just in case they start looking a little bit more shriveled and not nice and firm like in this picture. We didn't really have time because we're knocking up on our hour to talk about dividing, but if you have questions about dividing, you can ask us and we can give you more information. But division is often best to wait until spring. That way you're not causing wounds that can contribute to rot over the storage season. Storing cannas, you can allow the frost to kill the tops, but you don't want a hard freeze for that root. Let the roots dry for a day or two, and then clean off the soil and layer them in something like a peat moss or coco coir that you can keep a little bit moist, just a teeny bit of moisture in there so they don't dry out. And once again, wait until spring to divide. You want to make sure there are at least 3 eyes per division if you are doing a division. Storing gladiolas. Gladiolas are going to be lifted in the fall, either as the plants start to yellow or after you have the first frost. Make sure that you remove the soil, but don't wash it. These aren't ones to get wet. Cut the stems back. So this is the root. This is being held upside down. So you'll cut the stem back to where it's about 1 to 2 inches long and allow the corms to dry. Usually a day or two. These ones can actually come into the sun a little bit, and put them in a location where they're not going to be either too wet or too dry. If you have any corms that are old, shriveled up, not looking great, this is your time to kind of cull and reassess, and only keep the ones that are nice and plump looking. And then caladiums, you want to lift these well before frost. These ones are probably our least frost tolerant, or least, like they're not going to deal with cold temperatures, like Alison said. Make sure that you let them dry in a warm, dry spot, preferably out of the sun for about a week. Cut the foliage back after it turns yellow, and store at a warmer temperature. These ones could be stored anywhere in your house, up to 60 degrees or so. They're not going to tolerate those 35-degree temperatures in your unheated garage. So final tips: if overwintering your bulbs is just too much work, consider them as an annual expensive plant flower that you put in. That's kind of what I do. I don't buy very many, but I'll buy a dahlia or two and maybe a canna or two and put them somewhere in my yard, and I don't do anything with them. I've tried the pot and pot. It does work, but the remembering to take care of them over the winter sometimes can be a lot. So definitely can go that way. If you really want a lot of these, you can buy your plants in bulk from a lot of online retailers, and you can get a much better price. So it can be kind of a fun way to go. And try some new species this year. Maybe try something you haven't tried before that we talked about, or maybe even something that we didn't talk about. Diversity in our gardens is a great thing to do. Cool. So that leaves us with 5 whole minutes to answer a few questions that we might not have gotten to, if you have any. So feel free to pop those into the Q&A. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.
And I do want to say that someone had asked, can you plant pansies in a container with like a summer blooming bulb that would come up later? Yes, this is exactly what Maple the Beagle, who really isn't this skinny, is showing you. So this was very early in the spring. I planted some pansies just to have something to look at. And then those cannas came up later in the summer, and it was awesome. And when it got too hot, I just pulled the pansies out, and the cannas loved it. So be creative. You know, you have a pot of soil or media, definitely use it and rotate plants through the seasons.
Yeah, and I saw somebody asked if there's going to be handouts. We will send out a summary of the varieties that we mentioned today. So that will definitely be. After planting, how to protect from dogs. Ah, yes. Alison, you have a lot more experience in that. Do you want to take that one?
You know, so in the garden, it's going to be tough. So this is where actually tomato cages could come in handy, or some sort of fencing. So as the tubers, as the corms start to grow, you need to protect them from the dog trampling or just curiosity. Something in a container, my dogs, as beagly as they are, they generally don't touch them. But it would be like any new plant. So if you have rabbits, if you have curious dogs or cats, do provide. Exclusion is #1 in keeping your plants protected.
Let's see. Looks like Mari is answering that one. I see the lily of the Nile. Oh.
Lily of the Nile. Yeah, is it agapanthus? No,
yeah.
They will not overwinter.
The they other are one, annual.
Yeah, they're an annual. The other one, though, that might overwinter is crocosmia. So we took that one out, but like your lily, so if you're looking for one that isn't something that requires digging up, crocosmia is hardy to like zone 5B, 6A. So like your lilies, it will need some heavy mulching. But again, what the books tell us and what actually happens in our own landscapes may not be true. But crocosmia is one that you can consider. And it's a little bit like an orchid where it has an extremely long bloom. So if you bring it indoors, it will bloom for a long time.
And crocosmia, like if you have a warmer spot in your yard, south facing, and you can mulch it in as well, that's going to give you more of a chance for overwinter.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. How long will a dahlia tuber take to sprout once planted? We don't water dahlias when we plant. Yes, but unfortunately, I think I would say it depends on the size of the tuber, the depth that you've planted it, the
warmth of the soil.
The warmth of the soil, and of course, if you've planted it in potting media, it's going to probably make its way up sooner than if it's planted in a clay soil. So it's a little hard to say. Do you have? I
would say, gosh, at least probably 2 to 3 weeks before you start seeing any movement. It's a little bit like potatoes. If you've ever planted potatoes, like to actually see green growth, you almost run out of patience. So patience is key with a lot of these. Yeah.
Yes.
Wendy, your recommendation? Yeah, you could put chicken wire over just like you would with your fall bulbs that you plant. So if you're putting anything directly into the landscape, you could put chicken wire on top and then cover that with your wood mulch. That's a great suggestion for anything that might dig in the landscape. Yep.
Heavy mulch, then, yes, 4 inches.
3 to 4 inches is perfect. Yeah, so join us next week. Amy Lentz will be here talking about backyard berries. And then we have a couple more classes after that. But backyard berries, if you're looking to add fruit to your landscape, it's a really easy way to incorporate some shrubs that are not only attractive, but also give you fruit. And thank you to Mari and Meryl and to Amy and Cassie. And we appreciate you joining us today for this webinar.
Yes, thank you so much.